They used to have at least sometimes 2,000 people on the beach on a good Sunday. And they had a 3-tiered diving board, a 3-foot board, and a 12-foot board, and a 20-foot board. I can remember when I was 7, my father would set me up on top of the railing, which was a couple more feet higher than the top deck, and I would dive off into the lake at Miller's.
Mineola Miller owned the Miller's Beach over in Suffield, on the Suffield side of the lake, and that was a very colorful time for me. I used to sneak away and go over on Sunday afternoons, and my brothers would give me a free ice cream cone, and then I'd sneak back home and get a spanking from my father for going away.
By 1770, when Southwick became a town, there were people living in all different parts of Southwick, not just near the Westfield border. This is an early map of the border between Connecticut and Massachusetts. And as you can see, what we now call the jog was much larger. But in the meantime, in the 1600s and 1700s, Enfield and Somers and Suffield had become permanently part of Connecticut. But the little jog area, which you can see on any modern map in Southwick, was not settled until 1804. The reason that Massachusetts dug in its heels about not giving up the western part of Southwick was because of the water power. The Congamond Lakes are spring-fed, and they have one outlet called Great Brook. Massachusetts was interested in keeping the water outlet because that water was used to power a grist mill and a gunpowder mill. Before there was dynamite, gunpowder used to be used in construction. And they needed the gunpowder for the war effort also, the Revolutionary War, and then the war in 1812.
My grandfather, Nelson King, was in the lumber business, and he used to buy land just to take the timber off of it back around the turn of the century. He used to brag at one time when he started he could buy land at $1 an acre. Now you can't buy land at $1 a square foot. He bought the land just to take the timber off of it, but realized that it had recreational possibilities. And before they finished off in the 40s, they had built 36 cottages around the pond, a huge dance hall that had to be 40 feet by 70 feet with oak flooring and a bandstand and lighting, special lighting and everything. And had put in sand for a beach and a small store and men's and women's bathhouses and everything to make it almost a resort.
And people used to come from New York, from Boston, get off on the train just up the road from the lake, and then they would get in a carriage, horse-drawn carriage, frequently, and be delivered down to either Miller's cottages or the lake house.
My grandfather, Curtis, bought this property from Mr. Warner from the Holiday Group north to the Massachusetts line. All the property west of the dirt road, which is now Babbs Road. He bought that in 1898 for $500. He had to borrow the $500, but he right away started building rowboats and renting them, and building cottages and renting them to professional people from Springfield. That's how he made a living. He built lots of, some of them are still down there, all the way up to the Massachusetts border. And they lived here, and he rented the boats to fishermen, and the fishermen would bring their wives and kids to swim here and picnic here while the men were fishing. And my grandmother, Viola G. Milliken Babb, started selling things out through her kitchen window there. That's how the business started. And more fishermen came, more picnickers came. She added a little store to her kitchen, and that's how it grew like Topsy. And my father right away started dancing. And in the old horse barn, he put a floor in it. And the first band, Happy Harrington, played here in the 1900 something. And then he built another bigger dance hall and another one. This is the fourth one. And he built this one right at the height of the Depression, somewhere around 1930, 32. And right away he started to book the big bands at the time. Monroe and Paul Whiteman and all the big bands.
I can remember Tommy Dorsey and his band, Harry James and his band, Sammy Kay and his band, Kay Kaiser and his band.
Back in those days, there was a lot of people called hermits, and there were hermits that lived around the lake. And my mother would get a hold of me at certain times and say, I just cooked an extra chicken, and it's all wrapped up, and I want you to take it down to Mike, who lived across the street from Saunders' boathouse. And these people lived in little old shacks, and they didn't bother anybody, and they didn't want to be bothered. My mother would always caution me, don't go near him and don't say anything to him. You just go up and tie this chicken, this package, to the tree outside his place, and he'll take care of it. And as years went by, I wasn't frightened of them. One of them lived on my father's property where he built a new house, and that kind of impressed me. Arthur Gillett said to my father, he said, I'll sell you this land. He said, but there's an old man that lives on this land, and you have to let him live there until he dies. And my father told him it wouldn't be any problem. And I can remember my father spending hours conversing with this man and chopping wood for him, and my mother would send him food all the time. So my childhood was full of nice lessons.
My father would go to the Eastern States Exposition when they closed and buy all of Old Town's canoes because they didn't want to ship them back to Maine, so he got them pretty cheap. So, plus our 35 rowboats and about 20 canoes kept us busy renting them. Canoe business was popular at night. 11 or 12 o'clock at night before we could get them in. We'd put a big searchlight on the roof and try to spot them and bring them in. It was a long day. but those people came dressed up. I mean, the men with ties, the boys, they were dressed up. The canoes had rugs in them and pillows. It was a classy night out.
Back in those days, a lot of the Italian people congregated close to each other, and most of them worked in the ice business, harvesting ice off the Congamond Lakes. Congamond Lakes were ideal for making ice. The winters back in those days were very cold, and the water was ideal for making ice. And my father worked full-time. He was a foreman in the ice company. I think it was called the Southern New England Ice Company. They were based in New Haven. They owned all the property around the lakes on the Massachusetts side.
There were five great big ice houses here. The Walker, the Congamond, the Hygienic, the Crystal, the Berkshire. The biggest one was the Congamond. And my father and his two brothers had 8 horses between them, and they'd drive a team apiece to scrape the snow off the ice. And they had another team of horses. They'd take it down there, and somebody else would drive it. The man and his team got $7.50 a day, which was very good money at that time. They scraped till they got the thing done. Then it'd snow again. The foreman would say, "Money's in the sky for you guys." Another fellow would speak up and say, "We're going to get a tractor that'll do more than the whole bunch of you." Well, they got the tractor, but also came the electric refrigerator. And the whole bunch of them was out on that deal. They used to scrape that snow off and leave it in windrows like you would the hay when they rake it. Leave it in windrows. And that was a winter's job for them. And when that snow got all out of the way, they would get one horse, and he'd pull that thing, and somebody steadied it like a plow or a cultivator. And that marked the rows for where the ice was going to be separated. Then they had the chisel bar and separated it from there. And they also had to cut it that way, and they got a square chunk. And that was floated right down. They floated that right down to the place where they had an endless chain and hooked it onto, just pushed it right onto there. From the water on that pond, it went up the bank, an endless chain, and into the ice house. And there was another chain, and it would take the ice right on through. They had different sections, and the people that were in each section had this hook, and they'd pull it in and stash it in neat order. And they had it that way the whole length of the ice house. And if some of it got out, didn't get picked up, who cared? They had more than they needed. And when that layer got filled the whole length of the ice house, they'd lift the thing up and do another layer. And there was Mr. Hamburg. He had the job of when that ice went onto that endless chain from the pond, there was some sharp prongs on there, and that whittled the ice down so they were all the same thickness. They'd have some snow mixed in, and that got scraped off very easily that way. And the guy that did that, he just stood there and ran that thing. He practically froze to death by the time he got thawed out during the night and the time he got ready to go to work again, he was just about thawed out, and then he had to go to do that same job again.
One of the stories that sticks in my mind was my dad would tell me that they had a brand new 1928 Chevrolet truck. I'll give you an idea of the time we're talking. And I was allowed to ride in the truck when it went around. And they needed help. It was hard to get help. So they would take that truck and put some hay in it and some moonshine, and the driver would take it down to New York City, and he'd go out to the Bowery and then would use the moonshine. He would entice people to get in the back of the truck, and when they woke up and came to, they were here in Congamond, and they had to work in the ice and eventually get enough money to find their way back to New York.
Come Saturday night, and they got their pay. They'd go right across the pond where they hadn't taken off the ice. Off on this other side, they had taken it off, and it would freeze during the night a little. They'd go across the lake to where they made whiskey on their own stove. A lot of them did it and sold it to those workers for outlandish prices. Well, then they'd come back, half in the bag, and some of them wouldn't make it. They'd go to where they had taken the ice out, and it froze over a little bit. In he went. It wasn't enough to hold him up. Well, they'd get him out in the spring. I know the undertaker said that was my job. I had a horse and wagon and a box, and my job, it was an all-day job to get down and get them. They were called the floaters. Nobody knew who they were.
It came the time that the refrigerator was invented, and they no longer cut ice. And the ice houses, I remember playing in the woods and seeing men up on top of one of the ice houses, and then suddenly they erupted into flames. And so I saw that those ice houses, they weren't all arson, but two of the largest ones were, and I was a witness to that. But I didn't tell anybody until just now.
I remember some of the ice houses burning, and you could see the fire for miles, and it would leave a pile of ice and burnt sawdust inside. Those ice houses were also probably the size of a basketball court, if not larger. The size of a good big gymnasium, if not larger. And they were high, several stories high. We used to climb up on top and walk around. We used to go in there in the summertime, and it'd be 45 degrees. You could sit up there in sawdust, chip away some ice, and it'd be nice and cool. Be 90 outside, 45 inside.
At one point, they were building boats, my father and my uncle, which seemed only natural at the beginning because they were in the lumber business, so that they could build rowboats from the planks that they took from the trees. And they weren't too expensive at the time. My father used to say that when they first started selling rowboats, they sold them at $1 a foot. You could buy a 12-foot rowboat for $12 and a 14-foot rowboat for $14. In the later years, they moved up to building boats from plywood. And at one point, 1 year, they had hired a couple of extra carpenters, and they produced 100 boats in 1 year.
The Saunders family started back in 1843. I'm actually the 5th generation Saunders to run this business. It was passed on to me from my dad, from his 2 uncles, from their father, from their father. William Saunders started it with a little, no more than a clapboard shack here on the water. There used to be across the street, there was a Lake House Hotel, and that's how this business started, with 6 rowboats, wooden rowboats tied to a tree, and that's how they started.
After that boat, that first one, Mascot First, gave out, I don't know if that's when we had those speedboat rides. I think it was. Next was the speedboat ride. Carried 9 passengers. It'd go about 40 miles an hour, and covered the people in the back with a tarpaulin, and he'd turn, take sharp corners and spray them, and it was a thrill ride. Next was that gondola with 2 point on both ends that came from the Chicago World's Fair in 1930. He bought one of those and had it shipped here, and that lasted us for quite a while. That was our passenger boat. Then the last one, we went, it was an Army landing craft. We got it up in Worcester and had them put a nose on it, and it looked pretty nice.
This very chair that I'm sitting in now, my mother bought for my grandfather because he had trouble with his hips and stuff like that as he got older. And he had the arms on the chair so he could get up out of the chair. And anyway, he'd sit in the chair here by the door back in when this first came around, this new building. My father built this in '58 after the flood. And this older guy came in and he says, your grandfather was hysterical. He said he would sit here in the chair and never raise his voice, never get excited or anything, and someone would come in and ask about renting a boat. Yep, they're $1 an hour, $1 a day. That was all he'd say. He says it was just funny. He says because people come in and they still do the same thing now, where we still rent rowboats today for $10 a day. A lot of it is because it's a family heritage thing, and it gives people, a good affordable way to get out and expose them to the water and fishing and stuff. Well, when you rent them by the day like that, a natural first question is, well, how much if I only go for an hour or two? And that's where I know his expression, they're $1 an hour, $1 a day came from. So
on North Pond, the old canal went out the north end of North Pond, and it was just plugged with an earthen dam. And the dam just was about 3 or 4 feet above the water at normal water level. And in 1955 we had 17 inches of water rain in 2 days, and the lake came up over 4 feet, and it went out over the earthen dam and washed out the earthen dam, and it washed out a gully about 30 or 40 feet deep, and the lake level in North Pond went down about 15 feet, leaving us out of business effectively for 2 years.
We had that canoe house with about 20 canoes in it, and the water came up 5 feet and flooded the canoe house, and the bottom canoes started to lift the top canoes and started to lift the whole building, and the raft started to float away. I had it built on the ground, and it picked it up. I took rowboats and put them on a raft and filled them with water. I did everything I could to hold it there. It was a mess. That was the end of our business for that summer.
They hung in there with the business. There's various stories back in the 18s or early 1900s how they'd almost lost the place for $3 or $4 tax bills and stuff like that. And when you look back and you think about stuff like that now, it seems kind of funny. But like I said, it was passed from generation to generation, each one expanding on it a little bit more. Everything stayed as it was with the original building, just added on to up and through the 50s, and then the flood of '55 wiped them out. The place was still standing, but not really. It was a pretty much total loss. And he was able to locate the present building we have now, which I'm told came from Wilbraham Academy over in Springfield. It was this was a church over there. I'm looking at the building now to help reference. It's actually backwards from where it was. The part that faces the lake was actually the front, I think they call it vestibule or entryway to the church. And the steeple that was on it, he donated to a church, I believe in Granby, that was starting are just chartering out when they started back when they built this building.
In the 1820s to 1840s, there was a big push called the Canal Era. Everyone wanted to have a canal because the Erie Canal was so successful going from Albany to Buffalo and getting people farther west. Southwick's part of the was part of what is called the Farmington Canal. It went from New Haven to, when it was finally completed, to Northampton. And the canal entered South Pond, and what they needed was a tow path for the horses or mules to tow the boats. They were fairly small, not very deep boats, and they came into Middle Lake and crossed Middle Lake on a pontoon bridge. And I always think it's neat that when the citizens restoring Congamond were looking for something interesting to do, they built a pontoon bridge of pontoon boats.
We grew up very, very poor, but still very, very rich in that we had the biggest swimming pool in the world as far as we were concerned. We had the biggest skating rink in the world as far as we were concerned.
I had estimated about 3,000 swimmers on a good Sunday. And we sold so much ice cream that Frojoy, they would send their ice cream truck here full of ice cream, and as we would empty the cartons, they would fill us up from the truck. We did so much business that they were here all Sunday afternoon, keeping us supplied with ice cream.
Miller's Beach, huge crowds would come there in the summer to swim. It would cost, I think it was 20 cents. We charged 20 cents, and you could go inside the fence. There was all kinds of buildings. It was a big, huge bathhouse. And one of the things that was unique to that beach was the slide.
As others have said, Southwick was, at least in the summer, a great place to grow up.
Growing up, it was paradise. It was like Henry Thoreau's Walden. It's just about untouched.